Well, a man charged for holding a convenience store clerk at knife point during a robbery last year has been sentenced to prison. Police say 29-year-old Richard Fondville robbed a Stop and Shop store in Kingsville back in July of 2018, holding the store clerk at knife point and ultimately leaving that person tied up in a storeroom. A customer eventually came in and freed the clerk and called police. Fondville was sentenced to 30 years in prison for kidnapping, 30 years for aggravated robbery, 10 years for assaulting a police officer at the scenes. All the sentences to run concurrently.